Welcome everybody to the latest Knoca workshop, Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, which we're delighted to be partnering with FIDE, the Federation for Innovation in Democracy Europe, on this issue of this question of permanent climate assemblies, whether we should be thinking about moving towards away from the more ad hoc processes that we're all familiar with, the one-off processes where nations or cities or localities run assemblies, to actually seeing these as part of our permanent democratic and climate governance infrastructure. I'd like to thank Nabila Abbas from FIDE, who has written a very helpful introductory document. I'm sure you'll all agree, looking at why we might be interested in permanent assemblies, and also giving us some insights from some early movers, some early cities that have adopted these processes. I'm actually delighted to be able to hand over to my to my friend and colleague Yves Dejaeghere. Sorry, I pronounced it. You say I've only known you 15 years or something, Yves, and I still can't pronounce your surname. Who's actually going to be introducing us to the idea of permanent climate assemblies, and also introducing us to three really interesting case studies from Brussels, from Milan, and from Paris. So if I can hand over to you, my friend, and I shall sit back and enjoy the show for a while.
Thank you, Graham. And one day when we know each other for 30 years, you'll get that name right. Welcome all of you, and thank you, Knoca, for hosting this, and Danish Board of Technology for assisting in preparing this. It seems we have a very large crowd for this meeting, so I think it's a topic that is really at the point of where, in general, deliberative democracy is standing right now, but also climate assemblies are heading towards, is the idea of permanency. And there's a very it's a very logical step. If you do something one time and it seems to work, it would be very strange to not do it a second time or in more iterations. It either means you've solved the problem right away in one go, or that assemblies wouldn't work. But going from ad hoc assemblies to permanent or institutionalized assemblies, and in the beginning of the briefing paper made by Nabila, we do kind of emphasize we're talking here about permanent assemblies rather than institutionalized. So please read up on that, where we make the distinction, but very open to keep this discussion going between the two of them. Is that in the beginning of a number of the big assemblies, there was a climate assemblies. Yes. Part of that thinking, think of the French Convention Citoyenne, made it feel like it was a one-off. And now going forward, a number of cities have gone to much more repetitive assemblies, in some cases specifically about climate. We have one case here, Paris, where it's not specifically a climate assembly, but where topics that are dealt with by the assembly are around climate. Now, there's a number of advantages of going from a one-off assembly to a repetitive process. Yes, and I'm just going to go through a number of those that we highlight in the paper, but we're welcome also in the second hour to hear your discussion and your suggestions on more about this. First of all is ad hoc versus permanency is about the arbitrary timing of many ad hoc processes. If you make processes much more permanent, you can tie them much better to certain policy cycles, to certain moments in policy making that fit better than having a one-off at one moment. Also, climate issues are central to every policy field. So part of making this permanent makes it easier to tackle the long-term problem that climate is. Also to move, for example, towards issues of adaptation, which are much more also now needed, and not just looking at trying to prevent CO2 emissions. Another element which the three different cases will probably highlight is it also solves a number of problems you can have with oversight and monitoring. I think, for example, in Brussels, Merlijn, who will talk after me, might highlight this. In a permanent assembly, part of the governance you can set up is also a way that there is a sort of permanent monitoring and looking at what comes out of assemblies and how that is integrated into policy. It even allows to then take up this as a question for a next assembly and to keep working on certain elements throughout different cycles. Another element, which especially in some places is very important, is cost reduction. Setting up an assembly is expensive. Yes, we know that some national assemblies have been really cost intensive, both in time but also in resources. And doing this on a repetitive basis will allow you to have cost reduction. Also because, and if we're looking at the people who speak today, you will have permanent staff that doesn't each time have to start from zero, and that can take on lessons learned. Another element, which we might not yet see, maybe in some of the really first institutionalized assemblies, like in Ostbelgien in the German-speaking community, that is not a climate assembly, is that we know that there's transformative effect on citizens coming out of assemblies. They become very active. In the French Climate Assembly, for example, some documentaries have highlighted how many of these members then become very active in their own communities. If you do several assemblies, you have more and more people who take up that role in their community. And so increasing those transformative effects is also something that you will have much more with permanency than with a one-off assembly every so many years. Permanency also creates a learning environment. Again, I think here we will have some insights, I think, for example, from one of the speakers in Paris, where adaptations have been made from the first cycle to the second cycle, learning from how things can do better, what works, what doesn't. If you do a one-off, that of course might also happen if you do another one years later, but it's much less likely. Whereas in permanent assemblies, there is continuous learning within the administration, but also within the people who do the process delivery going forward. And so it just leads to better processes. Finally, making something clicked to your policy making will improve how the public sees the legitimacy of these assemblies. Part of this is also just them becoming an official part in some ways of policy making itself, gives it a higher legitimacy and a higher sense of respect than what is almost like a project on the side within climate governance. Now, there might also be a number of drawbacks from permanency. One of them being the sense of co-option. And happy to hear some of the thoughts in the second hour from the room here. The idea, of course, that policy making of climate is now, in a certain sense, between advocacy policymakers. These citizens are placed in between as a solution, but this also means that policy making and the citizens are placed very closely to each other. And some have claimed that there are risks of citizen washing, especially if in some cases, for example, recommendations might be cherry-picked. And so this closeness between citizens and policy making might be, I think in French, there's an expression, to embrace, to better suffocate. So how do we avoid this? Then there is possibility of a lack of a sustained commitment that we highlight in the paper. This might be if, for example, one specific party is seen as pulling a permanent assembly, and then in the next cycle, this is less of interest to other policymakers. It might just slowly fade away. Finally, resources is a positive, but also be a bit of a contra argument that it requires a lot of staff time. It requires a lot of input to run a permanent assembly. Maybe also there, people like Merlijn can highlight a bit how this is seen in Brussels. And then a final thing is, of course, these assemblies, as you will see in the different examples, an ad hoc assembly might need less governance complexity than permanent assemblies, where, for example, extra bodies might be put forward to do agenda setting, to do monitoring, etc., to do input. And this complexity of governance might make, in a certain way, some of these permanent assemblies a bit less transparent to citizens looking from the outside and looking a bit more complex than a simple unique assembly. So to talk about all of this, we have three amazing examples from throughout Europe that have started this experiment with permanent assemblies. We will first hear about Brussels, then about Milan, and then about Paris. The first two are specifically climate assemblies, permanent climate assemblies. Paris has a permanent citizen assembly, but some of the topics that have been dealt with by citizens are related to climate itself. So we will start with Brussels. So let me introduce you to Merlijn de Rijcke. I hope I pronounced that right. Who is projectmedewerker, project coordinator at Environmental Brussels, Leefmilieu Brussels, for this permanent citizen assembly. And he's one of those resources that has been attributed by the Brussels region for the permanent climate assembly, a permanent staff member to work on this permanent assembly. Merlijn, can you tell us a bit about how the assembly works, what you have learned? And the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. I will share a presentation. It will contain two parts. So first I will present really the project, how it's working itself, but I will not take too much time for that since most people here are like experts have already a lot of information. But in the second part, I really will go a bit more in detail how it's really linked to the climate governance in Brussels and also the things that we have learned in the meantime, because actually here the project exists since around 1.5 years, and we launched recently the second cycle, and it's kind of interesting to see already like what we have learned and which way we are evolving to. So I'll try to share my screen. So first I will explain a little bit the context. So why the government or like the political level really decided to create this project. Then I will, in a few minutes, explain how the project works. So like how, with all the details in it. Then how it's integrated, and then actually the influence of the citizens on the climate governance. And then at the end, I will put in front some challenges and also the lessons learned of it, because I think the most challenges, I think most people are aware of it. And it's kind of interesting by testing it each year again and to evolve that we really can improve it as well. So actually, the first thing, I just took a quote of the minister who's responsible of climate transition, but also for participative democracy. So the Brussels residents have the capacity to see where the problems are because they live them. And actually, that was actually really the main idea of the government when they decided in the general policy statement in 2019. The whole government decided like, okay, if we want to have a vision for Brussels in 2050, how it can be low carbon, we also need to involve in this the citizens and all the other actors like economical, social, and institutional actors. And also when we look to the more juridical aspect of Brussels in the climate law, there is also an Article 6 that is really like making it possible and almost an obligation that also citizens should be able to participate in the contribution to the climate policy. And actually based on those two aspects, so the engagement of the government and also the juridical aspect that was behind it, actually the government decided to work together with an external actor. And in this case, it was the G1000 who helped us with the project to really define the model and to apply it to the reality of Brussels as well. Because I think there's really a lot of experience about citizen assemblies, but I think this part was so crucial to really see like, okay, but in our reality, what would work, what wouldn't work, and how can we integrate it to the existing climate governance. But I will come back later to this. I first will explain a little bit the project, how it is working. So actually in the first step of the project, there's actually a committee that will make the agenda. And it's actually maximum 25 people that have been participating before in the previous cycle. that will define together the topic of the next cycle. So it's really a project that is driven by the citizens itself. So it's not the politics who will say it has to be this topic that is treated by the citizens, but it's the citizens themselves, based on their previous experience. They can say, okay, we participated, we saw that this part was really missing, so we think it could be very interesting if the next group of citizens could work on this topic. And it's also kind of interesting because it's not just like this, that they just have to do it all alone. They also receive a lot of information of contributions of the parliament, the government, the administrations, the local level, but also social actors about what they think that might be interesting where the citizens can work on. And by this, they have also clear view on, okay, it's maybe a plan will be reviewed in a few years. And then they also know where they can have the most valid contribution as well. And based on those two elements, the citizen will decide on which topic the next cycle will work. But this is, of course, in a certain framework because it's an assembly on climate. So it has to really be something linked to climate and also linked to the competences of the region. Of course, they can work a little bit out of this. I will come back later to this as well. But since it's an initiative of the government of the Brussels region, it's also important that a lot of the recommendations they do are linked to this level, because there they really can have an impact and really something can be done with what has been put in front by the citizens. Then the second part, I will not go too much in detail because I guess most of you know it already, but then we do like a lottery in 2 steps. First, 10,000 letters, where the only criteria is how many people live in each commune of the 18 communes in Brussels. And then based on the people who respond positively on this, then we will do a second selection based on kind of some social economical criteria. And then we will arrive on a group between 65 and 100 people based on the diversity of the Brussels region, which is kind of interesting. I just put it here on the side. It's like in the first cycle, on the 10,000 letters, we had around 3% response rate, so 297 people. And now we saw already for the second cycle, due of some actions we did, but I will come back to this at the end for the evaluation as well, that we almost went up to about, in total, 570 people who signed up. But I will come back to this, but this is one, I think, of the advantages of a permanent assembly, that you really can learn, that you can improve, and bit by bit can also make people trust in your project as well and make them motivated to participate in it as well. Then once we have the group, there is like this thematic committees, and actually they have 2 goals. So this group at the end will end up with a long-term vision. So on the topic, so the topic of this second cycle is, for example, food. And then it's like, how can we guarantee sustainable food is accessible for all in 2050? So they really will work on the long term. But also more specifically, they will look, okay, but what do we need tomorrow and in between today and 2050, more concrete, to reach there. And they will work together about this final report in different steps, where they will learn from different experts about the topic. They will debate, and at the end, there will be a vote. Voila, but I will not go too much more in detail. Then kind of an important next step is at the end, when they have their final report, they will give the report to the government. And then actually how it's foreseen in this model, there's 2 steps. So there's the first step that after 3 months, they handed over the report to the government. The government will give a first answer, but this first answer will be like very technically. It will just be, is it feasible or not what is proposed by the citizens? Is it something that maybe exists already a little bit or not? So it's like not a very large answer, because 12 months later, then there will be a second answer of the government, and there it will be more concrete. So in this concrete answer, there will really be a roadmap where they will show, okay, this has been done, this is what we will do in this timeline, and it's really to show more concrete to the citizens what will be done with their work. And then kind of a special element in this project, and I think it's a very positive one, is the follow-up committee. And it's actually 10 people who participated in the debates. They will stay for 1 more year. So they will be selected via an internal draw based on, of course, if they are motivated or not to stay 1 year longer. And actually, it's kind of interesting because they will really evaluate, okay, the first feedback we had from the government, is it really a good answer? Is it really a response to what we did? Is it really giving valorization to our work? And actually, they will give feedback to the government. So they will say like, okay, but actually you give this answer, but what does it mean? What's behind it? And it's really like to push it a little bit farther and really to make sure that really they have a follow-up and a feedback like they hoped as well for them, because actually they're putting a lot of time and efforts to participate, and they really want to have the same valorization of their work in the other side as well. And then actually, so there's also a supporting committee. And the supporting committee is kind of interesting because there is two different supporting committees. There is one who's really focused on quality. So there we have an expert on inclusion, an expert on climate, an expert on participation. And it's really follow up the project in the long term. Really like, is it still democratic? Is it still contributing to reducing the, to achieving the climate goals? Is it really inclusive? It's like all those elements are evaluated in the long term in this one. But there is also a technical supporting committee. And this one is kind of interesting as well, because during the cycle, it's very important to inform the citizens as correct as possible about what exists already, but also like from different kind of views. So the view of the private sector, the view of the public sector, but also like associations, the academical world, and also the view of the citizens themselves, for example, via collectives. And actually with this supporting committee, this technical part, we also will inform as correct as possible the citizens about a large variety, what is linked to the topic where they are working on. To come back a little bit, like how this project is created into the climate governance. Actually, so when we have the Brussels climate governance, of course, it's the minister and his administration who is responsible to really put in place the policy, and of course all the other administrations and other ministers linked as well to this topic, which is very broad. But actually in Brussels it's a kind of a special context, because we have the new actors around who has been developed. So we have an independent committee of climate experts. Actually it's kind of interesting because they are really looking on really a technical aspect. Are we really achieving the climate goals as they have been put in front? Then we have the Citizens Assembly on Climate on this one. And this one is really, it's also the social aspect. It's really like, are we really putting in place something which is realistic for the citizens as well? Is it responding to their daily life? And then, of course, but that's in more studies, there are also the advisory councils, who also are all the social actors who are active in the field, with a lot of people who are involved in this as well. And it's actually all those actors together that are like creating all the time in a continued evaluation of what is going on, and if we are involving in the good direction. And which is kind of interesting is like in the Brussels Administration for Environment, we have a new service. It's a service called Climate Transition. And it's very interesting because this makes it really possible to create a strong link between what is done by the Citizen Assembly on Climate and by the whole Brussels climate governance in itself. Then a second part, which I think is also very interesting in this model as well, is actually, so the secretary of the permanent Citizen Assembly is integrated in the administration of climate. So actually, which is very good because it makes it possible to have a good link and a good flow between what is created by the Assembly towards the government, but also what's done by the government to make it flow back to the Assembly. And actually, I think an organ like this in this kind of project is very important to really guarantee that there's like a good follow-up, also internal, on what is done by the citizens. Yeah, and that's just a bit to show in an image what I said before. So actually, at the end of a cycle, there will be a first analysis on the feasibility of the in the first 3 months, and then there will be a first reaction, and then 12 months later, then there will be the second reaction where there will be much more details. Sorry.
Can you wrap up? Sorry.
There was a question. I'm not sure.
Can you slowly wrap up to keep in time? Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, so actually, what happens with the work of the citizens on a paper that will be written? Yes, a follow-up will be done. What, how, when? When it's no, it will not done. Why? And is there an alternative? But also, what is kind of interesting is also that behind the screens, it also has a big impact. It's so it's like, okay, maybe they have a concrete recommendation, but it's very interesting is that in all the administrations, in all the different cabinet of the ministers who are involved in this project, everything will be analyzed and discussed. So automatically it will arrive in the discussions. And here in Belgium, for example, in the period just before the elections, it's kind of interesting that it is even things that can be taken in account when they will put out their big lines for the next government term. And then one other very important element is like there is an idea to develop on the Brussels region a long-term vision. And this one will really based as well on a social input. And there the input of the assembly would also be used as well to integrate in this vision together, of course, with a lot of other actors. But there they can really have a strong power or really follow up on what has been done by the citizens themselves. Then to end the presentation, the first part, like I said, I think the difficulty is really like diversity and representativity, especially like in a city as Brussels. I think an important thing with citizen assemblies on climate, it's kind of an auto selection, because when people receive a letter and there's written a citizen assembly on climate, if you're not interested or you don't want to participate in it, it will be very difficult to convince those persons by a letter. But it's also very important to valorize them. So really like give a proper fee for their participation, give food, make services that they really can be there, really recognize their life. And I think, sorry, I passed the time or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay, then I will just let one last point. I think budget is like extremely important. If you do it, you have to do it good. And I think it's also a sign of a political engagement. If you want to do it, you really put the funding there to really do it qualitative, because it's also respect towards the citizens. And I think it would be interesting to have kind of a database of all those kind of projects who have been done before, to have a clear view on how much it costs to organize this kind of type of projects. So I'm sorry for not respecting the time.
Thank you, Merlijn. And 10 minutes is very short for all of you, I know. Just for the people in the rooms, in the second hour, you'll be in a breakout room, arbitrarily with one of the 3 cases where you have another 10 minutes to ask more questions. So we know it's a short time, but I'll quickly pass the floor to Giuliana Maria Gemini, who works at Poliedra, who is linked to the University of Milan and works with the city of Milan on their permanent climate assembly. And I think, Giuliana, you've been involved both at the development of the permanent assembly and now the running of the permanent assembly. So the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes, Giuliana. Thank you for being with us.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you hear me? That's already something, but Alessandro will show the slides instead of me, because I have some problems with my computer at home today. So we will kind of try to make it a double presentation between me and my colleague. As Yves was saying, yes, we are working, I work for Consorzio Poliedra from Politecnico of Milano, and we have been developing the Milan Citizen Assembly, let's say, since 1 year and a half, the real permanent citizen assembly, but we were involved also in a pilot case study. That is maybe the reason why the Milan municipality decided to be brave and started this permanent assembly experiment at the beginning, and now a permanent something. The assembly in Milano is one of the action of the Air and Climate Plan. That is a voluntary tool that the Milano municipality has done, composed by 49 actions that together try to work on environmental and climate topic in the city. The permanent citizen assembly is the way Milano municipality chose to include the voice of ordinary people living in the city and ask their help in some way in the implementation phase of the Air and Climate Plan. So how do we work in the Citizen Assembly? As we were more or less in the same way as in Brussels, we had sent a number of 10,000 letters. Well, I'm speaking about the first year of activity, so the pilot year, and then I will try to give you some idea of what we changed and how we are thinking to implement and redesign the assembly for the next years. So out of 10,000 people that we called, more or less 800 replied and were available to be involved in the assembly. And we sorted out of this group a smaller group of 45 people, as the Assembly in Milano is composed by 90 citizens. And for the first year, they used to work 6 months each in a smaller group of 45. So in the whole 2023, we had a number of different group of people, one after the other being involved in the Assembly. First 45, then 45 more, reaching the number of 90. And then the first group left and a new one entered the Assembly. In which way is the Assembly working? We work on an annual basis. And the idea is that every September we do the civic lottery, choosing the people that will be involved in the following year. And we focus on which actions of the air and climate plan we, when I say we, I mean myself, as I'm very involved, but I mean the Milan municipality, is ready to work together with people. I told you there are 49 actions in this plan. They move from mobility actions to some related to resilience, some on food policies, some on circular economy, and so on, all related to climate objectives. But they don't have the same timing, and not all of them are ready at the same time to be discussed and implemented together with citizens. So every year, Milano municipality decide on which specific actions the Assembly can work, and provides for a number of possible working groups to organize the activities of the Assembly itself for the following 12 months. Then people in the Assembly has time to discuss the actions together with the experts and the technicians of the municipality that are always sitting together with people during the work. And they work on two different levels. On one side, after the discussion, they give their opinion, their endorsement or not, to the actions of the municipality. And they work to provide some recommendation and proposals for the implementation phase of the actions of the air and climate plan itself. And this is the deliberative phase. Then the different groups goes back to the plenary, and the plenary is the place where the voting phase is possible. And we need for having a proposal adopted, the 2/3 of the Assembly to vote positively for each of the proposed action. Then the whole group of proposed initiative go to the municipality, and this is supposed to happen at the end of the year, and the municipality has time to reply in 2 months, giving the reason why they will consider for the implementation of the air and climate plan action the proposition from the Assembly or not. So in this first year of activity, some more hints on how it worked. 2 things that we really think that are relevant. We ask people to sign for a participation agreement at the very beginning of their involvement in the Assembly. Each people is signing a personal agreement that is regulating the reciprocal commitment in being involved in the activities. And then the activities of the Assembly are founded on a guideline document that we are reviewing for the next year, but for 2023 was our basis to give people the rules and the way they should have been involved in the activities for this year. The very first meeting we had was in December 2022, and we met once every 2 months in plenary, and each group of 45 people met for 4 plenaries. So the circle for each group of people is around 4 meetings. At the very first meeting, they know each other and they know what the assembly is and what the air and climate plan is. And then they start working in the smaller group. At the beginning, with the first 45 participants, we just opened 4 different thematic working groups. And then when the assembly itself became of 90 persons, we added more thematic groups to let everybody work in small situations, which of course are easier for people to express their opinion and work together. And then in March, at the 3rd meeting of the first group, the new group arrived. So we gave time to know each other, and they started to work together, the older participant and the new one. And then in the 4th appointment, there is the deliberation. That means that with this pilot first year of activity, we had already 2 deliberations, and we are ready for the last one in November.
We have 1 minute left.
Okay, then I go to some of the ideas that we are thinking to work on for the next fully operational assembly years. We definitely think that we need to establish and formalize a better relationship between the assembly and the municipality. We have been working very well with the environmental area, which is the one that wants the assembly, but still municipality is a big entity that needs to be more linked to the assembly activities. We need to redefine the way we involve people. I mean, we won't have any rotation anymore next years, and we will organize individual interviews to engage people. One of the problems I want to share also with Brussels and Paris is those that leave the activities, and then we are supposed to be 90, but one meeting after the other, the group is becoming a bit smaller. What else is relevant? We think that we should ask the Assembly to state clearer their position on the actions of the air and climate plan, which is very relevant for the municipality, and maybe focus on less recommendation, but better defined. And now that the proposals and recommendations of the first year of activities are on the table of those who decide, we will see how much the Milan municipality will really work on what the Assembly is proposing and putting on their table. In 9 minutes and few, I think we can go deeper in the parallel working rooms after. Yves?
Thank you very much, Giuliana.
Okay, I've done my best to be quick.
Again, we know it's very short, but I can see that documents are shared in the chat. So if you want to know more about the assemblies, please look there. And I've seen Merlijn has also been sharing some documents. Our third example and our last speaker is the Vice Mayor for Participation from Paris, Anouch Toranian.
Hi.
Hello, Anouch. So the Paris Permanent Assembly is not a specifically climate one, but citizens did work on climate topics, and I think also the next iteration, végétalisation, and I leave it up to you to translate that into English, is one of the topics that citizens will work on. So if in 10 minutes you can explain a bit how the Assembly works and what your learnings have been between the 2 cycles. The floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
I'm Deputy Mayor in charge of citizen participation, community life, and public debate. And as part of my mandate, my mission was to create the Parisian City Assembly in 2021. So this assembly was in fact a proposal shaped by the Parisians themselves after a consensus conference held in 2019, so in the previous mandate of the mayor of Paris. And after 3 months of public debate and thousands of contributions from the Parisians in order to strengthen the participatory democracy in Paris, one of the concrete requests from the Parisians was to create an Assembly of Parisians. So when I was elected in 2020, I had the difficult task to create this assembly. And in order to do so, we had a few mandatory guidelines included in the first citizen deliberation of France voted by the Council of Paris. So after this big momentum of public debate, so one of the first guideline was to create an assembly which allow citizens to have a direct impact on our municipal actions. Second, this assembly had to make solutions to make Paris a sustainable and inclusive city and guarantee a long-term vision. And third, to be able to monitor and evaluate the action taken by the city in order to do so. So in order to create this assembly, we created 3 groups of dialogue. The first group was with the experts. So this is why we partnered with the FIDE, because it was important for us to have an inventory of existing practices and feedback on what has been done in the world. So we interviewed together with Claudia, with Yves and a lot of people, elected officials, member of the Parisian administration, etc. We also had a dialogue with the citizens themselves, with the member of the existing bodies, participation bodies in Paris. So the Parisian Youth Council, the Parisian Council of European, this kind of body already existing before in the previous mandate of the mayor. And we had a third group of dialogue with the political groups represented at the Paris Council, and a consultation of the 17 district mayors of Paris. And this dialogue was very crucial for us in order to guarantee the legitimacy of the Assembly. So all this work of designing the Assembly led to an Assembly composed of 100 Parisians drawn by lot from 2 files to limit bias. The first one was the electoral list, and the other list was made from what we call the citizen card of Paris, in order to have young people under the age of 18, which is the the age at which you can vote in France. So we have also young people from the age of 16 years old. And now we have an assembly representative of the diversity of Paris, taking into account first the boroughs of Paris. As you know, we have 17 boroughs in Paris. So the assembly has to be proportional to the populations. We also had the criteria of gender in order to ensure parity. We had the criteria of the level of diplomas, and at the end, the criteria of age group, as I said. We have now an assembly composed by, as I said, 100 Parisians drawn by lot. These citizens are compensated on the basis of the day they work on the citizen assembly, so up to 44, which is the equivalent of jury's trial in France. The Citizens' Assembly was officially voted by the Council of Paris in October 2021, and they held their first meeting in November 2021. So now, what is the role of this assembly? This assembly has 3 missions. The first one is to ensure a citizens' watch. The second one is to decrypt and evaluate projects or municipal policies. And finally, they have to propose or influence policy decisions through citizens' motion and deliberation. A deliberation is the equivalent of the Parisian bill in the city of Paris. We just launched the second edition of the Citizens' Assembly this year, but if we look at the outcome of the first edition, first it lasted almost 1.5 years. The citizens met in total of 45 times. in a different workshop and 7 times as a full assembly, what we call the plenary assembly. They had 2 main phases. The first one was exploratory and learning phase, and the second phase was to build concrete proposition for the Council of Paris. The citizens worked on 3 subjects. In the first group, they focused on social and education. So they work on the renewal of the reading plan of Paris. The second group focused on environment. So they propose ideas in order to accelerate and make easier the energy efficiency of the Parisian buildings. And in the third group, they focused on the public space. They worked on the creation of the street code, which is the equivalent of the highway code to regulate the public space and its different use in order to protect the pedestrians. So each of these groups produced a vow, what we call a vow, which was voted by the Council of Paris. In the Parisian system, a vow is adopted in order to engage the city in order to realize something. It is less engaging than the deliberation. As I said, the deliberation is the equivalent of a bill, but it's still very important. So after the vote of these 3 vows, we created what we called a right to follow for the citizen of the first edition, in order for them to be able to follow the work of the city on these 3 subjects. To finish, so we launched in July the 2nd edition of the Citizen Assembly of Paris. We changed a bit the composition of the assembly with the bonus for the popular districts of Paris, and we put more young people from outside the European Union, what we call extra communitarian citizen of Paris. We also changed a bit the way the assembly worked in order to accelerate a bit their work, so that their mandate lasts 1 year and it's less long than the first edition. So we have now 3 workshops. A workshop dedicated to produce a citizen deliberation, what we call the workshop deliberation. We have a workshop dedicated to produce a vow. We called it the workshop exploration. And we have a third workshop dedicated to a kind of a citizen watch, which allows the citizen to ask a question to the Parisian Council on a hot topic or directly to the mayor of Paris. And these 3 workshops are made in order for the citizen to evaluate the time they want to dedicate to the assembly, in order to have a different level of engagement and different level of time engagement into the assembly. So yeah, that's it. We just launched the 2nd edition in July. They had to choose the topic they have to work on for this 2nd edition. So on the deliberation workshop, they will work on how to diminish and to make easier the situation of the homeless people in Paris. The second one on the exploration workshop will be dedicated to the vegetalization of Paris and how to make Paris greener. And as I said, the third group on the Citizen Watch will be more linked with the actuality of Paris. So yeah, sorry for the difficulties of connection, and I didn't have any presentation, so I hope everything is clear. And of course, I'm open to question if you have so.
Thank you, Anouch, and congratulations on that quick move from your laptop to your phone. So we have a bit of time now for questions. So I think Graham collected, I saw a good number of questions pass in the chat. In general, one of the things I do hear in the trees, the challenge of keeping people on board for that longer term in permanent assemblies. But I would first give the floor to Graham to give a few questions from the chat before I take my own.
No, that's great. Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to the presenters who are presenting very complex ideas in a short amount of time, and I apologize for that. We're going to have some more time to talk about it, and there's more details in the background note that accompanies it. There's a lot of questions, and we haven't got enough time, but I'm going to just pick 2 or 3 at random, I guess. The Paris mentioned it very briefly, but there was a question from Oliver about the resources and level of support that's provided to the citizens? I guess that's both financial, but also is there support for example, childcare and other things? So just some sort of comparison there. A question about who actually does the facilitation. I guess some of the question here is this facilitated by people within the administration, or is there an external organization? And what kind of facilitation style is used was an interest. And let's go for one more. And I guess the question here was, what's the role of elected officials during the process? Do they get involved in it at all? Are they observing it? The point that was raised by someone in the chat was these recommendations suddenly appear from an assembly. Do the elected officials and civil servants know what's coming? Do they get a chance to engage with the process as it's happening? So can you work with those, Yves?
Yes, and I think I'll moderate this a little bit. Are the questions clear? And maybe add a last one that is maybe a very relevant one that I saw pass in the chat. Do you have the feeling it really changed or made an influence in how the climate governance works in your city? Do you see a sort of influence from this additional organ added to your climate governance? So we have just 10 minutes before the break. So Merlijn, you want to have a first stab at one of those 4 questions, please?
I think maybe for our project, the question like how much is like the political level involved in the process? Do they know what is coming? I think for us, the process always will start with like the minister who will come at the beginning of the process. But then during the process, it's really important that there's no political influence at that moment, because it's really important that the citizen really can work independent from their sides. And then at the end, of course, it ends up again for the government. But what is kind of interesting in our project, I think, is like that we are in contact with the administrations who have the technical knowledge, which means that during the process, we also can couple back to them to ask like, okay, what the citizens are working on. Is it something that exists already? Is it something that can be very useful in what they are working on? Where are the priorities? And this also helps for the citizens to know and to reassure that what they're working on really will contribute to something. So I think like really political on the level of the ministers, I would say it's only the beginning and the end to be really independent as an organ of the assembly, but having exchanges with more the technical experts inside the administrations is kind of useful.
So Giuliana or Anouch, do you have moments during the assemblies where the political level, I think that's the question, gives feedback or interacts with the group on their work or recommendations they're working on?
Yes, maybe. I mean, we have this phase where the elected officials come and present their work. For example, for the second edition, we had a list of subjects on which the Citizen Assembly could work. So they came and they presented their work and the whole aspect of their particular delegation, because what was really important for us was that the citizen work on concrete proposition and not just out of any topic, and not linked to the competence of the city or linked to the delegation of my colleagues. So it was really important for us to make the elected official present their work and how the citizen can have a direct impact on their delegation and say what is already done, what is still has to be done in order to strengthen the policy. So yeah, we have this first phase, and then in the second phase, if I must say, when they work, we really want the elected official to be out of the system in order for the citizen to work on their own, linked with the administration. And this is where I can make a link with the first question on the resources. We have a whole administration dedicated, with the general secretary dedicated to the assembly. We have a lot of trainings, visits, interviews with the different actors of the sector. So this is the time where they work directly with the administration and not being in a relationship with the elected official. This was really important for us.
Okay, Giuliana, just to give the question, and I think we only have time for one question because we have several speakers in this webinar. It makes it a bit hard. But actually, in Milan, politicians already have made the climate plan, so the citizens work on implementation. Just to specify the question a bit for you, have citizens at some point in Milan not complained, but argued with the fact they're working with a plan that's already fixed by the politicians? That they're working more on implementation, or?
I would say the very first group got the point and was quite happy with it, and with the precise remit to work on the implementation. But even if I know that there was something good in having this group going one together with the other and so on, as we discussed together, I think that maybe we missed something when including the second one. So the more we are working, the more the feeling I have is that these citizens, they don't really understand why they are working on such a specific something instead of giving overall ideas on climate, which I think is not only our fault that we are not clear, but it is something that is not very easy to understand, even if working on implementation, and sorry for Anouch, which is a politician, in some way, we don't go anymore to the decisional of the city council, as they already took their decision that the air and climate plan is there, and we can proceed with people ideas only with the agreement of the directors, the technical one of the Milano municipality, which is easier than going again back to the city council. We will have a monitoring activity of the overall air and climate plan every 2 years. So yes, at some point we go back to the politicians, but we are free to work and to implement the actions that the Assembly is suggesting to the technician of the municipality, and I think this is something that makes it stronger. One more word on the other side, just a few words. I think that politicians are needed, and I mean the mayor and the deputy mayor and so on, to motivate people. They understand that they have the feeling that if the mayor is there, or if a relevant somebody from the political level is there, is giving them more authority, and this is mainly to motivate more than choosing, more than on the decision that the Assembly is taking. This is my perception.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give the floor back to Graham because we're at the end of the first hour, and I think it's time to. Graham,
okay. Thank you for the input so far. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time for questions at this moment, but the second half of the workshop, hopefully you will have more time for to get some of your answers. What we're going to do is we're going to randomly, because that's what we're all about, we're going to randomly allocate you to a workshop which will be hosted by someone from Knoca, as well as one of the experts from one of the assemblies. So you're either going to end up in an assembly on Brussels, on Milan, or in Paris, and it'll give you a chance to ask some more detailed questions. But we're also going to get you to think with us about how we can take this, what we need to do to take this wave of permanent climate assemblies forward, and what the kind of questions we need to ask to make sure that permanent bodies work well. So thank you, everybody. I think we've learned two things about this. One is we needed more time in order that people could present their designs, and we also needed more time that people could talk about them and talk about permanent assemblies. So clearly we've got something going here which is of a lot of
permanent workshop.
We have a permanent, someone said we should have a permanent workshop about permanent assemblies. Very good, very nice. Giuliana wins the prize for the best joke of the day, without doubt on that one. So what I'm going to ask is each group to come and just to give us maximum a couple of minutes of very quick feedback. I'm just going to do the first group, and I think the main themes that came up were, we need to get some consistent evaluation going of these permanent assemblies in order that we can get some rigorous learning. some really interesting debate about the range of competencies that these assemblies should have and who sets agendas, and some really interesting questions there about giving space within these processes for politicians. And then also, you know, this is a real opportunity for really communicating climate assemblies, because they are permanent processes, and what kind of, we need to think much more systematically about that communication process. And then finally, someone said, well, if these things start embedding, we can actually start having really interesting networks of permanent assemblies who could actually interact and do work together, which was I thought it's quite enough that we actually start to get permanent assemblies, but there's people already on to the next stage of how they actually start networking with each other. So that was from my group. I'm just trying to figure out, won't be a second, who group 2 is. Won't be a sec. This is Yves. Are you or someone from your group just going to feed back some of the very brief learnings from your group?
The only silence in my group fell when I asked who wants to volunteer to talk. So
isn't that always the way, Yves?
It ends up being me. We talked about several topics. One was a question and a reflection on political headwind and how to overcome installing this. So a number of questions were about the initiation. I think many of the people in this room are from places where this does not exist. How do you? So it's. So Merlijn emphasized the support from the government and also showing that this works. So the examples of showing that it works somewhere, but also the role of the administration. So for Merlijn, it helped a lot being in the administration to convince people in bureaucracy of climate policy to overcome their reticence. It's not only politicians, it's also in the administration. Let's say technocrats is maybe a bit negative, but people who work on this also see citizens coming in. We had a lot of talk about actually how to manage that energy from people coming out of assemblies. How can we harness this? One of the things we emphasize also in the paper very shortly is permanent assemblies can actually get more people into assemblies, and we know that this transforms people. So several of the people in our room, Ophélie, Deborah, and Georg, talked about how can we, for example, support people coming out of this. I know, Graham, there has been Knoca work and with Pete on this. So, but in permanent assemblies, this might become more important. Also, there was a good question from Bjorn, who was one of the co-designers of the Brussels Assembly. What was the worst design decision we made? And I think resources is just very important. It's very banal, but looking to design for the resources you have, a lot of the elements require support, budgets, funding, even if it is just for having extra meetings. Merlijn, for example, talked about the evaluation group. Great idea, but if you don't have resources to pay citizens for these extra meetings and to sustain them, then of course that becomes something nice to have in the design, but that is hard to sustain. So these are a number of elements. And then Deborah said something interesting at the end. There should be a flatter hierarchy on both sides. Also, citizen assemblies have to sometimes interact with very complex hierarchies of policymakers. And it would help if there would be a flatter hierarchy to interact with. That's a bit what came in.
No, that's very conceptual, but a nice way to end. Nabila, what did you have from?
Yeah, we discussed also a range of different topics. So perhaps one of the most important was that this permanency also brings something as a change in the administrative culture, or at least it's unfolding and it's in process, and that it also brings a hope for general improvement of democracy. Then the question was raised how it is facilitated, and that there is a general secretary in full time in Paris to do that. So that also brings us back to the question of resources, and that is very important also to show how serious the administration takes this assembly. We talked about the follow-up and how it is thought through that first it wasn't institutionalized, but if I got it correctly, it's getting there. And then the whole link or the idea that in order to implement the recommendations and to be the most effective possible, so that the recommendations do not only end up in a drawer, that the link with the elected representatives and with the administration is very important, and in Paris very strong.
Okay, thank you so much, Nabila. That's great. This is really Mark. Is it you or is it someone else from your group?
I failed in actually asking if anyone else wanted to share.
No.
So I'll be doing it, but I'll invite anyone from our group to join. I'll just highlight 3 things that we talked about. So first of all, we talked a lot about the recruitment, and Alessandra and Sarah, who were both a part of the team from Milan, shared that they had about 8% sign up, which is actually quite high, but that they were lacking on particular groups. So very young people, very old people, and migrants. And I think these are universal things that I recognize across the board for many people. And they did, for the second part though, add a question around bias, or around specifically whether people have a lot of prior knowledge around these topics, or do activism, etc., which is a part, of course, of creating the legitimacy case, that people are not just the ones who normally would show up anyway, but are actually representative. And I think there's something about the whole selection of citizens that we spend a bit of time on, which is always interesting and relevant, and perhaps even more so when it's permanent. And then Tele said something really important. He just kind of reminded of one of the reasons why. I'm just going to read the words from Tele here. Basically, the reason for doing this is to innovate public governance for the sake of resilience, sustainable development, and climate neutrality. Now, that's, of course, Tele's words, but I think it is very important that there's a reason why we're doing this. And the reason for doing this is shouldn't be forgotten, but it also ties back to this notion of bias, because it should be for the full political spectrum, shouldn't it? So there's a question that we didn't have enough time to talk about, but I think we could have talked much more. And then just on a final note, we had this ongoing discussion about how much this sits within the administration, within the policymakers, and the clear response, and Alessandra and Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed that there's a growing understanding of what a climate assembly is, because it's recurring, and a growing understanding of how it can be used. So that might still be work in progress, but the fact that it's being repeated actually has an effect on how well known and understood it is.
That's great. Thanks. That's really important point. Thanks, Mark. Morten, what did you get from your group?
Yes, so I'm gonna keep it short. We discussed, especially I'm gonna highlight the challenges that we've discussing, making more permanent climate assemblies. So one of them was how to get real diversity and get those that are not usually heard more available. An issue also for ad hoc assemblies, but might be more relevant here. And then we also discussed what happens if with the legitimacy of these processes, if recommendations are being ignored on the long term. Then if you have permanent institutions like this, it's worth having a thought about this as well. And then how to link up with existing policy areas, processes when you have the permanent, important to be addressing as well to make sure that it works. And then a learning from the Brussels Assembly was that it's kind of a thin line embedding these assemblies within the administration. So they have had good success with making the assembly members sharing a draft on the recommendations 1/3 part of the process, and then having administration to comment on them. But this is also a potential risk of limiting the scope for the participants, the assembly members, to think out of the box and be more creative about radical ideas and such. Yeah,
I think that's a point that we keep coming back to, which is about how constrained should these assemblies be, if at all. I think it's a really interesting question. Thanks, Morten. And Stina, from your group.
Yes, I will just pass on the floor to Benedetta Carini.
You were actually successful in getting someone else to speak.
I was forced. I'm joking. So yeah, so the first part we presented ourselves, of course, and then we had André from the city of Paris. So he, like, some of us asked questions about the Paris case. So, for instance, how do they then implement the recommendations? And he gave us some insights on this. And then Katie raised some.
Oh, we've lost Bernadetta for a second there. Oh, Stina, you see, you can try and force somebody, and then what happens is their internet collapses because it must be under emotional pressure from you.
Yeah, I don't know. The internet is very sensible in that way. So, well, I hope that maybe Benedetta is coming back, but maybe I'll just shortly point out that we also talked about diversity and whether diversity is something else than collective intelligence and how we bring that into the permanent assemblies. Yes, and questions about what kind of decision making in the current indirect democracy would permanent assemblies replace. One last point is citizens assemblies becoming a tick box, a buzzword being used for very much consultation rather than having decision-making capabilities. So we had a lot of different questions up, and now Benedetta is back, and maybe we can give her just a minute also.
I'm sorry about it. I don't know what happened. I don't know what you said in the meantime, but yeah, I was sharing the concerns that Katie raised about the process, like bottom up versus top down, both in the establishment of the assembly and also on the topics selected, and also on the number of people. So she said that maybe 100 people is too little, and this can somehow hinder diversity. So then we talked a bit on about the trade-offs. So since it's consultative, the municipality needs to be willing to work on the topics. So in this sense, a bit of top-down is probably needed. And also about the diversity, so many publics, the diversity is given by the selection process rather than number of people. So then we discussed a bit about this. And then Iago had a probably very interesting question, but we were forced back in the main room. So I'm still focused, Iago, about your question.
Iago always has interesting questions, and if you missed it, that's a shame. Anyway, listen, thank you so much for that. I'd just like to, just before we end, I'd just like to pull Yves and Nabila into this space, if I can. So it should be just myself, Yves, and Nabila.
Yes.
Are we here? Yes, here we go. That's fantastic. I'm not there. I don't think I'm there, but that's fine. I'm here. It's fine. So I'd like you both to reflect on a little bit on what you've learned. But Nabila first. I mean, you wrote the initial document that we've been using for the basis of this workshop, and I'm just wondering. Having kind of like gone and done the research and kind of like sort of thought that you had everything understood in your head, is there anything that you've heard in the last sort of couple of hours that's made you think, oh, we really need to focus on this issue or this issue, and they're places we really need to put our attention? Is there anything that's really jumped out for you?
Yeah, perhaps the question that you raised in the discussion, also that you picked up about how large should be the scope of action of these assemblies, because that was something that I feel like in all three of them came up in different ways. So the Milan assembly, which focuses much more on implementation, and then the other ones who also think about how empowered should this decision of citizens be. On the one hand, to give them power and to create assemblies that are impactful, but on the other hand, also without overloading citizens with and creating governance structures that are overly complex.
Mm-hmm.
So should these assemblies focus more really on creating completely new recommendations? Should they link, or how is the link to already existing policies, especially if you think about climate assemblies that would be permanent, then there must be somehow an ongoing link to existing policies, and link to that perhaps also the question of agenda setting power, because we have in Paris and in Brussels both assemblies give through different mechanisms this agenda setting power, but at the same time perhaps through the presentation of Merlijn, it came up for me that I thought, yeah, but at the same time it can be challenging to maintain this agenda setting power, and on the other hand think about what is the link to existing policy. I mean, there is a balance to
no, it's really interesting. It's a really interesting kind of balance and challenge, I think, Nabila. I think that's really a key one. Thanks for that. And Yves, I didn't say at the start, I should have said this, that you're actually, I don't want to say you're personally responsible, but you have been part of the design team, or led the design team in Paris, and then were involved in the Brussels one. And I know you've also been giving advice to Milan. So obviously anything that's wrong with these processes is your fault. I completely understand that. But I guess my question is, we've now had these processes, some of these processes running, they're into their second year. What do you wish you had known when you were doing the design that you now know now that you wish you'd actually been able to actually spend more time and attention on?
It's a good question. It's actually a question that Bjorn raised to Merlijn. Like, you running this, what is the worst thing we've done? Basically, one of them is resources. Of course, we design we as designers sometimes like a bit the fact that, you know, what is the budget or the staff or resources available in this community to do this? And especially moving from, these are cities with some capacity to, we've heard from Paris, and I've met these people, very capable, dedicated people. Same, Merlijn has been hired full-time to do this. Poliedra helps the city of Milan. In smaller places, you might even have to run this with, how do you do this without this carrying capacity? Yeah. But an element I want to, you know, hearing this, also being in the group with Merlijn, this is still new. So actually, part of a number of elements listening to this is, I know that in both the cases I know better. Milan, I haven't been that close following it up. But is that there's a lot of learning also from colleagues in the administration, politicians for the first time changing their attitudes towards this. So we should also maybe have a second iteration and then ask these questions again. One of the things, and I'm just going to make Iago happy, is and you know, this discussion, Graham, you know, this is a long-standing discussion between, it's my shopping trolley thing about climate assemblies in the beginning, that they were a bit like everything in one assembly. And so doing multiple ones allows to reduce the question, but I see we're still tackling very broad topics. And whether, again, this agenda setting, how we're doing this, is it better to have more, even smaller groups tackling narrower questions or not? This goes between Milan and you know, this question in general in assemblies, and should we reduce scopes and have more focus on specific trade-offs, or broader, almost in some cases, a bit of ideation around policy? And so where even permanent assemblies are still sometimes resembling generic, more broad assemblies, and how we look at this problem of, you know, how narrow should repetitive assemblies be in cutting up policy fields to make recommendations that then hit policy harder, maybe.
So I think it's a really,
those are two things.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think the
Graham,
challenge.
what have you learned?
What have I learned? What I've learned is that this community wants to talk some more about permanent climate assemblies. That's what I've I mean, actually, what I've learned, I think, is really about the the fact that there are some really similar problems that the three assemblies, or challenges that the three assemblies are dealing with, but also there's some very specific challenges related to the way they've been designed and the way they've been implemented. So, for example, you know, the Milan one being much more focused on the administration, whereas Brussels being focused on policy development, actually means we're talking about very different institutions. And in the same way that no two climate assemblies are the same, we must remember that no two permanent assemblies are the same. And the way that they are integrated within the wider administration, within the broader political system, will help us understand what the potential of those assemblies are. So I don't think we can just kind of look, is Milan better than Brussels, or is Brussels better than Paris? Because they're actually doing very different things. And I think we really need to remember that. And I think one of the things that a challenge for, well, I'm going to say a challenge for Nabila because she's the lead author, but a challenge for us making sense out of taking that document forward, I think, is for us to start trying to explain what the kind of, if you like, the challenges within within thinking about permanency are, depending upon what you want to do with it. I think for me that's going to be the key thing. Anyway, listen, look, we've come up to our 2 hours. We could carry on for ages on this, and I realized that we had to rush through these three cases very quickly. But we wanted to give you a real taste of what was happening out there. And I hope you enjoyed having a bit of a deeper dive into one of those assemblies in your groups. There's too many people to thank. So I'm just going to thank everybody from FIDE, everybody from Milan, everyone from Brussels, everyone from Paris. And I'll also thank my Danish colleagues for putting this together. We've got another workshop coming up in a couple of weeks, which is called Hosting Climate Assemblies in Challenging Environments, which is mostly going to be focusing on trying to think about how assemblies work in places which are suffering from political polarization and other major challenges and sort of quasi-authoritarian regimes, etc. So we're really thinking about how these assemblies can work in very difficult places. Listen, I've really enjoyed the last couple of hours. I've on a personal level, I've got so much out of this. I get a sense that for the amount of people who are interested in this and the amount of people who've stuck with us throughout the 2 hours, that this has been a really important conversation to have. I just want to say to the people who are working in Brussels, the people who are working in Paris, the people who are working in Milan, I am so impressed with what you're trying to do and what you are doing. And the community wishes you well with your endeavors. And we really look forward to hearing more from you and working with you in trying to make this a success. Thank you so much, everybody, and look forward to seeing you all at the next workshop.